The cold wind cut through the busy streets of New York City as Elon Musk, dressed in nothing but ragged clothes and with his face painted deep black, sat on the sidewalk. His eyes, once full of ambition and purpose, were now dull and hidden beneath a layer of grime. A scruffy beard covered his face, and his hands, once used to typing codes and designing rockets, were now clenched around a small cardboard sign that read, "Hungry. Please help." It was an experiment, a strange one, sure, but Elon was always known for pushing the limits, testing what people would do, how they would react. This wasn't a new idea for him. He'd done things like this before, testing the limits of human behavior, but nothing had prepared him for what he saw today. The world had reacted in ways he couldn't have predicted, and now he sat, stunned by what had just happened. He had expected some discomfort. Maybe a few people would glance at him with curiosity, maybe even feel sympathy. But no, this wasn't just a social experiment. It had become something far more complex. His heart pounded in his chest as the crowd began to gather, murmuring amongst themselves. Some of the people who passed by, they looked at him with disgust. They didn't know who he was, they just saw the skin color, the torn clothes, the dirty hands. But what had really shocked him, what had made his stomach twist, was when a police officer had approached. At first, the officer stood over him, peering down with a look of suspicion. Just another person who thought he was some kind of trouble. Then, to Elon's disbelief, the officer had pulled out a phone. Not to call for help, but to take a picture. With a smile, no less. What a joke, the officer had muttered under his breath. The man didn't even know who Elon Musk was. To him, he was just another black homeless man, a problem to be ignored, or worse, to be laughed at. The shock from that moment hadn't worn off. Elon sat there, trying to make sense of it all. Was it the skin color that had made the officer think it was okay to laugh at him? Was that all it took to make people forget he was a person? A human being who had built the future of electric cars, who had designed a spacecraft to go to Mars, who was worth billions of dollars, and yet here he was, invisible to the world. As more time passed, more people gathered. Some took pictures, some dropped coins in his cup, but others just walked by, ignoring him entirely. A voice broke through his thoughts. "Hey, you all right there?" a man asked, kneeling beside him. Elon barely turned to look. He wasn't sure if the man was asking out of genuine concern or just curiosity, but the voice sounded familiar. "Are you Elon Musk?" the man asked. For a moment, Elon's heart skipped. He hadn't expected anyone to recognize him like this, but how could he not? He built the Tesla empire, created SpaceX, changed the world with his mind. He'd been on TV and magazines all over the internet. But today he was just a face in the crowd, a face that had no place here. Elon nodded, barely able to speak. "Yeah," he muttered, "but you're not going to believe what's happened today." The man blinked, clearly confused. "What do you mean?" "I painted myself as a black homeless man to see how people would react. But what I didn't expect, what I couldn't have predicted, was how much hate there is. How much people don't care. How much they see me as nothing more than this." He gestured to his painted skin, his torn clothes, the sign on the ground. "I'm invisible. I'm a joke. They look at me like I'm nothing." The man's eyes widened, and he sat down beside Elon. "Wait, you did this on purpose? You painted yourself like this?" Elon nodded, his hands shaking slightly. "I wanted to know. I wanted to see if people's reactions would be the same if they didn't know who I was. Would they treat me differently? Would they help? Or would they ignore me because of the color of my skin? I don't know why, but I needed to know." The man sat in silence for a moment, his gaze wandering over the busy street. The noise of the city surrounded them, people laughing, shouting, walking by without a second glance. Finally, he spoke. "You know, man, you might be shocked by the way people treat you. But there's something deeper going on here. It's not just you. It's how people treat homeless people, how they treat people of color, how they treat anyone they think is below them." Elon looked up at him. "But why? Why would people act like this?" The man shook his head. "Sometimes people just want to feel better about themselves. They see someone lower than them, and they think it gives them power. Or maybe they're just scared. They don't want to get involved. They don't want to know the truth." Elon turned back to watch the crowds. Everything felt unreal. This was the world he had shaped with his work, with his money, with his fame. Yet here on the streets, he was just another face in the crowd. Another invisible person. And what had shocked him the most was how many people didn't care. They didn't care who he was, what he'd done, what he could do. They only saw what they wanted to see. The sound of a car honking broke the momentary silence. Elon glanced up to see a sleek black SUV pulling up beside him. The window rolled down, and a familiar face stared out at him. Elon's business partner, someone who worked closely with him at Tesla. "Elon?" the man called, sounding confused. "What the hell are you doing?" For a split second, Elon considered telling him the truth, telling him that he was conducting an experiment, that he wanted to understand something bigger than himself. But when he saw the judgment in the man's eyes, the discomfort on his face, he just stayed silent. The window rolled back up, and the SUV sped off, leaving Elon sitting there in stunned silence. What had just happened? Why was everyone so uncomfortable? Why did no one care enough to even ask if he was okay? His mind was racing. The world he thought he understood felt like it was slipping through his fingers. And yet, something told him he couldn't stop. He couldn't stop the experiment now. He needed to know more. He needed to understand what was really happening. But what would happen if he pushed even further? Would the reactions change? Would people get even angrier? Or would they finally start to see him for who he really was? The next person to walk past him was a woman in her late 30s. She paused, eyes narrowing at the sight of him, but this time, instead of walking away, she crouched down beside him. "Are you hungry?" she asked gently. Elon was caught off guard. "What?" She held up a sandwich from her bag. "Are you hungry? You don't look well." He looked at her for a moment, unsure of how to respond. This wasn't part of the plan. But maybe, just maybe, she wasn't like everyone else. Maybe she saw him, not just as some homeless person, but as a human being. Before he could speak, though, something strange happened. A man in a suit walked past, scowling at the two of them. "Get a job," he shouted at Elon. "Stop leeching off good people." The woman stared at him, then quickly stood up, offering the sandwich to Elon one last time before walking away, her expression turning cold. And that was when it hit him. This wasn't just about race. It wasn't just about homelessness. It was about something deeper, something that tied all of these issues together. But what? What had he uncovered, and what was going to happen next? He didn't know, but he needed to find out. He needed to keep pushing. Elon watched the woman walk away, her back straight, her eyes locked forward, as though she had never met him. She had shown him kindness, but it wasn't enough to overcome the harsh reality that had suddenly enveloped him. The man in the suit, his words echoed in Elon's mind. "Get a job. Stop leeching off good people." The anger in that voice had been sharp, and for a moment, Elon couldn't help but wonder if the man had seen him as just another homeless person. A problem to be dismissed, a nuisance to be ignored. No empathy, just scorn, but there had also been the kindness of the woman. It made him question everything. He sat there for a while, watching the crowd move past, each person lost in their own world, unaware of the man who sat on the sidewalk, now invisible, now just a dark figure in a sea of people. His heart sank. He had seen so much today, so many different reactions, so many faces, but none of it made sense. What did it mean? What was the point of this experiment, really? He had set out to discover something, to test how people would react when they didn't know who he was, to see if they would treat him differently. But now, in the stillness of his thoughts, Elon realized the deeper question. Was he truly invisible because of his race? Was it about his skin color, or was it about the way people saw themselves in relation to someone else? Was he an experiment, or was he a part of a much larger problem? His stomach growled, pulling him out of his thoughts. He hadn't eaten all day. That didn't seem to matter. What mattered was what he was seeing in the faces of those around him. Then, just as he was beginning to contemplate whether he should end the experiment, something unexpected happened. A young woman, barely 20, dressed in a hoodie and jeans, approached him. She didn't stop. She didn't even look down at him. But she did something unusual. She bent down and handed him a $20 bill. "Here," she said simply, "use it wisely." Elon blinked, taken aback. The woman didn't wait for a response. She didn't ask for anything in return. She just handed him the money and continued on her way. No hesitation, no pity, no judgment. For a moment, Elon was too stunned to even thank her. She had just treated him as a person, not as someone in need, not as a beggar. She hadn't seen him through the lens of poverty or race. She hadn't made assumptions. She had simply given him a gesture of kindness and moved on with her life. He stared at the $20 bill in his hand. It was one of the few moments during this experiment when he felt human, when he felt like he wasn't being looked down on or ignored. For the briefest of moments, he almost felt normal again. But the moment passed quickly. A loud shout broke through the air, pulling his attention to a nearby corner. A man, large and drunk, was yelling at a group of people waiting for a bus. Elon could make out the words, but the tone was clear: rage, frustration, anger. The crowd around him seemed to shrink away. moving to avoid the confrontation. Elon knew what that felt like. It was that same sense of being ignored, of being invisible. People didn't want to look at him because he didn't fit the image they wanted to see. And just like the man at the corner, it wasn't just about race. It wasn't just about being homeless. It was about the way people chose to see each other, or not see each other. The street was becoming more crowded, more chaotic, and as Elon sat on the sidewalk, he felt himself slipping further into this new persona. The man in the torn clothes, the painted face, the invisible figure. He had become a character in a world that didn't want him. But then, just as he was sinking deeper into his thoughts, he saw something that changed everything. A group of teenagers approached, laughing loud and carefree. One of them, a boy in a baseball cap, glanced at Elon and froze. His expression changed, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Elon felt a jolt of unease. Had the boy recognized him? Did he know who he was? The boy whispered something to his friends, and they'd all started to gather around Elon. The laughter died down, replaced by a strange, uncomfortable silence. Elon had no idea what to expect next. Were they going to laugh at him? Throw something at him? Maybe call for help? He didn't know what these kids were thinking. But what happened next caught him completely off guard. "Are you really Elon Musk?" the boy asked. For a moment, Elon didn't know how to respond. Should he deny it? Should he confess to them what he was doing? But the way the boy said it, his voice full of curiosity and uncertainty, struck something deep in Elon's chest. "Yeah," Elon said quietly, his voice almost unrecognizable, "I am. But I don't think you'll believe me." The boy blinked, taking a step closer. "What's going on?" he asked, his friends gathering behind him, now more interested than before. "Why are you like this? You're the guy who invented Tesla and all that stuff, right?" Elon nodded, trying to remain calm. "Yeah, that's me. But right now, I'm just like this. Just another person on the street. That's the point of this experiment." The boy shook his head in disbelief. "Why would you do that? Why would you paint yourself black and act like a homeless guy? You could just, I don't know, do something else." Elon sighed. "I wanted to see how people would react. How different would they treat me if they didn't know who I was? Would they see me as a person, or just someone to walk past?" The group of teens exchanged looks. One of the girls, her arms crossed, spoke up. "That's messed up, man. Don't you think that's kind of, well, I don't know, insensitive? Like, maybe you should just donate some of your money to actual homeless people instead of doing something like this." Elon felt a pang of guilt. She was right. Maybe this was more complicated than he had realized. Maybe, in trying to prove something about how people treated others, he had failed to see how his actions could be seen as disrespectful. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this, that something deeper was unfolding, something he wasn't ready to understand yet. The teens didn't stay much longer. After a few more questions, they drifted away, muttering amongst themselves. Elon was left with the feeling that he had just missed something important, something that could have opened up a new perspective. But what was that perspective? What had he learned from all this? The noise of the city around him started to feel suffocating. He wasn't sure if he was more confused than before, or if he had just scratched the surface of something bigger. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to stop the experiment. Not yet, not until he understood more. Then, as he gathered his thoughts and tried to find the next step in his strange journey, a man in a suit approached him. Elon tensed up. This could go either way, another scolding or maybe an act of kindness. The man knelt down slowly, eyeing Elon carefully. "Are you okay, man?" he asked. "You look like you're having a rough day." Elon didn't know how to answer. Something told him that what happened next would push this experiment into a whole new direction. But how far would it go? And what would it reveal about people, about society, and about himself? And what would happen when Elon finally took off the paint? Would anyone see him as the man he truly was? Or would he just be another forgotten face in the crowd? The suspense was unbearable. Elon wasn't sure what to make of the man in the suit. He had a quiet, professional demeanor, his clothes sharp and clean, a stark contrast to the ragged appearance Elon had forced upon himself. There was something about the way he knelt down, his eyes meeting Elon's, that felt different, like he wasn't looking at a homeless man, but rather a person. It was something Elon had barely experienced all day. "Are you okay, man?" the man repeated, his voice soft, but with a hint of genuine concern. Elon stared at him for a moment, weighing his words. For all the judgment and dismissiveness he'd seen, here was someone who was at least willing to stop, to ask. He was almost tempted to pull off the act, to confess that he was Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur, the inventor of Tesla, the guy who was supposed to be changing the world. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that revealing the truth might ruin everything he was trying to understand. This man wasn't asking for Elon Musk. He was asking for a person. Instead of answering immediately, Elon shifted uncomfortably on the cold pavement, glancing at the crowd around them. People walked by, some in a rush, some oblivious to what was happening, others sneaking curious glances, not stopping to help or to question. There was something both humbling and suffocating about the experience. "I'm fine," Elon said, keeping his voice low. "Just trying to figure some things out." The man looked at him thoughtfully, then glanced around, his eyes scanning the busy street for a moment before focusing back on Elon. "I get that," he said slowly. "Sometimes the world just moves too fast, and you feel like you're not part of it anymore." His gaze softened. "But you're still here, and that's something." Elon blinked, taken aback. Was this really happening? A stranger, a random man in a suit, was offering him something no one else had an understanding. His words weren't patronizing, they weren't judgmental. They didn't feel like they came from someone who saw him as less. In that moment, Elon felt something stir inside him, something that made him realize how little he had truly understood about human interaction, about empathy. Elon had spent his entire life trying to create the future, designing technologies that could take humanity to Mars, changing the way we drove with electric cars. But he had never once considered what it meant to truly see people, to look beyond the surface, beyond the labels, and to understand the weight of their lives. He didn't know if this man would ever truly understand what he was doing or why, but in that moment, Elon didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel like the world had turned its back on him. He felt heard, seen, even if only for a second. The man stood up, adjusting his suit and taking a step back. "Listen," he said, "I don't know what you're going through, but if you ever need someone to talk to or even just a meal, here's my card." He handed Elon a sleek black business card. Elon took it hesitantly, still processing what had just happened. The card felt cool in his hand, smooth to the touch. It was a stark contrast to the scruffy, painted appearance he had chosen for himself. The man's name was printed in bold letters, David Halloran, with a phone number beneath it. Before Elon could say anything, the man nodded once and turned to walk away. "Take care of yourself," he said over his shoulder, disappearing into the crowd. Elon sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the card in his hand. It was a simple gesture, maybe even meaningless to the man who had given it to him. But to Elon, it was more than that. It was the first time in hours he felt like there was a crack in the wall of isolation, of judgment, of being seen as nothing more than an object. For the first time today, he had been treated as a person. The $20 bill from earlier was still clenched in his other hand, and for a second, Elon wondered what would have happened if he'd revealed his true identity to David. What if he had told him who he really was? Would the interaction have been the same, or would it have changed everything? As he looked down at the business card, he felt something stirring inside him, a strange mix of gratitude and unease. Was this just another person who wanted to fix him? Or was this someone who simply saw him, truly saw him for what he was, a man in need of understanding, not pity? Elon was so lost in thought that he didn't notice the group of teenagers walking toward him again. The same group that had stopped earlier, the ones who had asked him about his experiment. They spotted him sitting there, still looking at the card, and slowly made their way over. This time, though, there was no judgment, no shock. There was just curiosity. "Hey," the boy in the baseball cap called out, "You good now?" Elon didn't know how to answer. He wasn't sure if he was good, or if he was still confused. But there was a change in the air now, a different energy. They weren't sneering at him anymore. They weren't mocking him. "I'm getting there," Elon said, his voice sounding more genuine than it had all day. One of the girls from the group, the one who had spoken up earlier, walked closer. "Listen, I'm sorry if we came off rude. It just seemed like you were trying to do something weird. But if you need help or something, you don't have to do this alone, you know." Elon nodded, appreciating the change in her tone. "I know, thanks." Another boy, a bit younger, tilted his head. "So, what's next? Are you still going to keep doing this, or?" Elon hesitated. The experiment. It wasn't supposed to go on like this. He had set out to learn something. But what had he really learned so far? That people could be cruel and dismissive, yes, but that wasn't the whole story. There were others who offered kindness, without hesitation or question. "I think I'm done," he said, almost to himself. Maybe it's time to stop pretending. Maybe it's time to just be. Me. The group didn't know how to respond to that. They exchanged uncertain looks before the boy in the cap spoke again. You don't have to keep playing games to get people to care. You just gotta be real. Elon felt a wave of warmth wash over him. It wasn't an earth-shattering revelation, but it was a truth he had needed to hear. The hardest thing in the world wasn't creating rockets or solving engineering problems. It was being real, truly real with other people. Letting go of the need for validation, the need for everyone to recognize him for who he was, and just letting them see him for who he wasn't pretending to be. Before they left, the girl handed him a small bag of food she had bought from a nearby vendor. For later, she said. Elon smiled faintly, his heart a little lighter than before. The group left, and for the first time that day, the streets didn't feel as cold. They didn't feel as crowded. But just as the chaos of the city settled back into its rhythm, another surprise hit. A black sedan pulled up near the curb, and two men in dark suits stepped out. One of them looked familiar, David Halloran, the same man who had handed in the business card. Elon felt a shift inside himself. Was this really happening? What was going on? What did David want? And what were they going to say next? Was this the moment when the experiment reached its peak, or was something darker about to unfold? He stood up slowly, his hand still gripping the business card. The black sedan idled at the curb, its sleek body reflecting the sunlight in the middle of the busy street. Elon watched as David Halloran stepped out of the back seat, his expression unreadable. The two men in dark suits that flanked him seemed out of place, their serious, purposeful demeanor contrasting sharply with the chaos of the street around them. Elon's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what to expect. Was this some sort of coincidence, or had the man really come back to find him? David glanced around the street, his gaze landing on Elon. There was no hesitation in his step as he made his way toward him, followed by the two men. The crowd didn't seem to notice the arrival of these men in suits, but for Elon, the whole world seemed to pause in that moment. The two men stopped a few feet away, their eyes scanning the surroundings carefully, as though they were protecting something or someone. David, however, kept his focus entirely on Elon. There was something unsettling about the way he walked up to him, something more deliberate than the casual tone he had used earlier. Elon, David said, his voice still calm, though now there was an edge to it. We need to talk. Elon stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do or say. The world around him felt too loud, too chaotic, and yet he felt a strange stillness in the air around David and his entourage. Everything seemed to slow down, and the weight of what was happening settled on his shoulders. What is this? Elon asked, his voice quieter than he expected. Why are you here? What do you want? David glanced at the two men standing behind him, who took a step forward as though to block the view of anyone nearby. It's complicated, David said, lowering his voice even more. But I think you already know that. Elon's mind raced. What did this mean? Why was David here? He thought about the business card from earlier, the strange encounter that had felt like a moment of clarity. But now something about this situation felt off. You don't have to pretend anymore, David continued, his voice almost conspiratorial. We know who you are. We know what you're doing. Elon's stomach churned. They knew? How? Before he could speak, one of the men in suits spoke up. You've been testing the limits, Elon. Testing human behavior. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here because we think you've uncovered something much more important than you realize. Elon felt a cold shiver run down his spine. His hands tightened around the cardboard sign that had become a symbol of his experiment, his disguise, his means of understanding. Was this it? Had his curiosity led him into something darker? Something bigger than a simple social experiment? David seemed to sense his growing unease. Don't worry. We're not here to harm you. We just think you need to understand something. He gestured toward the two men. These gentlemen are part of an organization. They've been watching you, Elon, watching your work, watching this experiment of yours, and now we think you're ready to learn the truth. The words hit Elon like a punch to the gut. An organization, watching him, for what purpose? His breath caught in his chest, but he tried to remain calm. What truth? What are you talking about? David took a step closer. The truth about people, about how they see each other, about what really happens when you start pulling at the threads of society. Elon's head spun. He thought he had been conducting a simple experiment to understand how race, homelessness, and human empathy intersect. But now, David was talking about something far larger. Something that felt like it stretched beyond the limits of his understanding. Is this some sort of game? Elon demanded. Some kind of setup. No, David replied quietly, his tone deadly serious. It's not a game. It's a process. One that's been going on for a long time. And now, you're part of it. Elon felt a rush of confusion, frustration, and fear. He had thought he understood the world, the way people treated one another, the way race and class shaped behavior. But now, nothing made sense. The ground beneath him felt unstable, like he was standing on the edge of something he didn't want to see. David paused for a moment, letting the words sink in before continuing. We've been monitoring social behavior for years, using experiments like yours. We've been studying the way society reacts when people cross boundaries, whether it's racial, economic, or cultural. What you've done here is just the beginning, Elon. The man's words hit Elon like a wave crashing against rocks. Monitoring? Experiments? His mind reeled, trying to process the implications. What was David saying? And why had he chosen now to bring this up? Was he involved in something far darker than he could have imagined? I don't understand, Elon said, his voice tight. What does this have to do with me? Why are you telling me this now? David smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. Because you're asking the right questions. You've crossed a line, Elon. You've done something that most people would never dare to do. And now the people who control these kinds of experiments, those who understand the real power dynamics of society, are interested in you. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Elon felt a rising panic in his chest. Power dynamics? People who control experiments. His mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, but none of them made sense. Are you saying, Elon faltered, his voice shaking now, that this is all part of some bigger plan? That this isn't just about me testing human behavior? That have been, what, manipulated, used? David didn't flinch. He nodded slowly. Yes, but not in the way you think. You're not the only one being watched, Elon. The world is full of these experiments. Social experiments, tests of human behavior, things that most people will never even be aware of. Your actions have drawn attention from certain groups, people who understand the true nature of human behavior. Elon's mind was spinning. So everything he had done had been part of something bigger, something he hadn't realized. The two men in suits stepped forward again, their movements deliberate. Elon's chest tightened, and his hand instinctively reached for the $20 bill from earlier. He clutched it tightly in his fist, trying to steady his nerves, but everything felt wrong. He had expected his experiment to be a simple reflection on how race, class, and empathy influenced human behavior, but this felt like something far more sinister. David leaned in closer, his eyes locking onto Elon's with a knowing gaze. You've stumbled onto something bigger than you know, and whether you like it or not, you're now a part of it. Elon stood frozen, his mind trying to process the overwhelming flood of thoughts. He had never expected his simple experiment to lead to this. He thought he was just a man on the streets, trying to understand the way people treated each other, but this felt like a trap. David straightened up, signaling to the men behind him. We'll be in touch. Soon. Without another word, they turned and began walking back toward the black sit-in. Elon's eyes followed them, still trying to make sense of everything they had just said. What was going on? And more importantly, why was this happening to him? As the car sped away, Elon stood alone on the sidewalk, the sounds of the city rushing back to him. But now, everything felt different. The weight of David's words lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. This was no longer just about an experiment. It was about something much bigger, something far more dangerous. And the worst part, Elon knew that he wasn't going to be able to walk away from it now. Not unless he uncovered the truth. But where would that path lead? And would he survive the answers? The questions burned in his mind, unanswered. Elon stood there, frozen in place, watching as the black sit-in disappeared into the bustling traffic. The world around him had resumed its frenetic pace, but inside, he felt like time had come to a grinding halt. What just happened? What was David trying to tell him? And who were those men in suits? His mind raced as his heart pounded in his chest. There was an underlying tension that had settled into his bones, a feeling of impending danger he couldn't shake. He glanced down at the business card, still clutched tightly in his hand. The words seemed to mock him now. David Halloran, it read. Elon had barely thought about it when David first handed it to him. But now, everything felt suspicious. Was the business card just a way to reel him in? A symbol of something more, something darker than he had anticipated. Elon stuffed the card into his pocket, his hand shaking slightly. He looked around, seeing the same crowd he had been observing all day. People hustling, walking by, each lost in their own world. No one seemed to notice the strange encounter that had just unfolded. But to Elon, it felt like the whole city had just shifted. The masks of normalcy everyone wore seemed thinner now, more fragile. He no longer felt like an observer, but a participant in a game he didn't understand. He needed answers. But where would he go from here? The experiment had been simple at first, just a way to understand how people treated him when they didn't know who he was. But now it felt like he had uncovered something far more complex, something much bigger than a social experiment. He started walking, his steps slow and heavy. His mind drifted back to the conversation with David. The words had echoed in his head since they were spoken. You're part of something bigger than you realize. The people who control these kinds of experiments, they're interested in you. The idea of being watched, of being monitored, it felt unreal. Elon had spent most of his life being watched, in a sense, by investors, fans, the media, and even competitors. But this was different. This was something shadowy, unseen, pulling strings behind the scenes. He wandered through the streets, aimlessly, not knowing exactly where he was headed. The city was a blur, the noise of traffic and pedestrians fading into the background. His thoughts consumed him. What exactly had he stumbled upon? Who were these people who had been watching him? And what did they want with him? As his thoughts spiraled, he found himself back at the bench where he had started the day. He sat down, staring at the empty space in front of him. It was as though he had come full circle. A homeless man with a painted face who had set out to understand the world, only to find himself tangled in something much more dangerous. What now? His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. No name, just a simple line of text. You've been warned, Elon. Stay out of this. His heart skipped a beat. A warning? A threat? He had no idea who could have sent it. But the timing felt deliberate. The words felt too real, too pointed to be a coincidence. He stared at the message for a few moments, wondering if this was the beginning of something far worse. He had to make a decision. Should he ignore it? Pretend like nothing had happened? Or should he dig deeper, find out more, even if it meant risking everything? Elon's mind flashed to the woman who had given him the $20 earlier. She had treated him with kindness, something he hadn't experienced much of in the last 24 hours. He remembered the group of teenagers, too. They had shown concern, not mockery. There was still hope, hope that there were people in this world who cared, who saw beyond race and class. But the truth was, he wasn't just dealing with people now. He was dealing with something far more complicated. The people watching him, the people who had orchestrated his little experiment, they weren't interested in kindness. They were interested in control, in power, in testing the limits of human behavior. As if on cue, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. He hesitated, looking at the unknown number again. Should he answer? Should he ignore it? He had no choice. He swiped the screen and put the phone to his ear. Hello? Elon said, his voice barely above a whisper. Good evening, Mr. Musk, a smooth voice said on the other end. I trust you've had a productive day. It was David's voice. Elon's heart rate spiked. How did you get my number? David chuckled, a sound that was both unsettling and strangely calm. Let's just say that we have ways of finding out information. We know everything about you, Elon. Everything. From the minute you started this little experiment of yours, we've been watching. And now you've piqued our interest. Elon felt a lump form in his throat. What do you want from me? I'm not interested in what you think I want, David replied coldly. I'm interested in what you want. You've asked some very important questions. But the truth is, you don't know the answers. Not yet. And if you continue down this path, you'll learn more than you ever imagined. Elon's mind raced. I don't understand. What do you mean? What truth are you talking about? David paused for a moment, as though considering how much to reveal. It's not about race. It's not about class. It's about power, Elon. Power that lies beneath the surface of everything you've been taught to believe. Power that controls people without them even realizing it. And you've started to uncover it. Elon's grip tightened around his phone. Are you threatening me? No, David said, his voice suddenly much colder. I'm offering you a choice. You can walk away, forget everything you've seen, and go back to your life. Or you can continue this path and face the consequences. But be warned, Elon, there's no turning back once you know the truth. The line went dead. Elon sat in stunned silence, his thoughts swirling like a storm. What just happened? What had David meant? Power? Beneath the surface? Was this some kind of game, or was he really being drawn into something far bigger than he had ever anticipated? He stared at the phone in his hand, his thoughts racing. This was no longer just about race or empathy. This was about something more sinister, more dangerous. a system that controlled people from the shadows, and he was in the middle of it now. Elon stood up abruptly, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to get out of here. He needed to think. But where could he go? Who could he trust? He turned and began walking away from the bench, his mind set. There was no going back now. He was too deep. He had already started to uncover the truth, and now he had no choice but to follow it to the end. But as he stepped into the crowded street, a feeling of dread washed over him. He could feel eyes on him. Not just the casual gazes of strangers, but something more, something calculated. Someone was watching. Someone was always watching. And the real question was, how far would he be willing to go to uncover the truth, and what price would he have to pay for it? Elon didn't know, but he couldn't turn back now. The journey had already begun, and it would lead him down a road darker than anything he could have imagined. Elon walked briskly down the street, trying to shake off the feeling that someone or something was following him. The world around him felt like a blur. He passed by people going about their business, their faces familiar but distant. His phone buzzed in his pocket again, but this time he ignored it. He didn't need another call from David. What was there left to say? The warning was clear. The lines had been drawn. He turned a corner and found himself in an alleyway, the noise of the city muffled by the walls around him. The towering buildings loomed like silent sentinels, their windows reflecting the dusky light. There, in the dimness, he finally allowed himself to stop and breathe. His thoughts were a whirlwind. The choice David had given him was simple enough: walk away, forget everything, and go back to the life he knew. Or continue down this dangerous path and face the consequences. But it wasn't a simple choice for Elon. He had never backed down from a challenge. He'd spent his life pushing boundaries, whether it was with SpaceX, Tesla, or his countless other ventures. This was no different, or so he thought. The problem was, this wasn't about technology or business. This was something personal, something that struck at the core of who he was. If he continued, there would be no turning back. But what was the cost? The implications of what David had said haunted him. Power beneath the surface, a system that controlled people without them realizing it. Was that what this was about? An experiment in human behavior? Or was there something darker, something far more insidious at play? Elon reached into his pocket and pulled out the business card again, staring at it. He had to make a decision. But what did David want him to do? Did he want him to expose something? Or was it a test of loyalty, to see if Elon would play along? As he stood there, torn between the need for answers and the gnawing sense of danger, his phone buzzed once more. This time, he couldn't ignore it. His fingers hesitated over the screen before swiping to answer the call. "Hello," Elon said, his voice tight. Elon, David's voice, came through smooth and unbothered, like their last conversation had never happened. "I hope you're thinking carefully about your next move." "I don't have a choice, do I?" Elon replied, his tone sharp. "You've already warned me. You know everything about me." David chuckled lightly. "We know more than you think. But this isn't about power, Elon. Not in the way you imagine it. This is about control. And the world, as you've been seeing it, is not what it seems. You've started to pull on a thread. And if you keep pulling, you'll uncover things that could shatter everything you thought you knew." "What do you mean by that?" Elon pressed. "What is this about?" David's voice became more serious. "You don't need to know everything yet. But if you want to understand, if you want to truly see what's happening, you need to come to a place, a meeting. We can discuss things further, and I can show you what you've been looking for. But be warned, Elon, this is not a game. There are no guarantees once you're in." Elon felt a knot tighten in his stomach. A meeting. He wasn't sure whether to trust David, but he also knew that he couldn't walk away now. He needed to know more. The curiosity, the drive to uncover the truth, was too strong. It was the same thing that had driven him in his business ventures, discovering the unknown, changing the world, taking risks that no one else would. But this was different. This wasn't a business deal. It wasn't a new technology to build or a rocket to launch. This was about something deeper, something that made him feel like he was in over his head. "When and where?" Elon asked, his voice almost a whisper. David didn't hesitate. "There's a warehouse on the outskirts of town. I'll send you the address. You'll meet us there, midnight. And remember, no one can know where you're going." The line went dead before Elon could say anything else. He stood still for a long moment, staring at his phone, wondering if he had made the right decision. It was almost as if David had known what Elon was going to say before he said it. He'd known that Elon couldn't resist, that he had to find out more. The question now was, what would happen when he did? By the time midnight rolled around, Elon was already on his way. He had rented a car, driven across the city, and left the crowded streets behind. The city's skyline faded as he took the highway toward the outskirts. The farther he drove, the more he began to feel like he was stepping into another world, one where the rules were different, where things didn't make sense. The address David had sent him was for an industrial area on the edge of town. The area was dark, mostly abandoned at this hour, a perfect place for a meeting. If you wanted to keep things quiet, keep them hidden. Elon parked the car a few blocks away, feeling the weight of the decision he had just made. He had no idea what he was walking into, but his gut told him it wasn't going to be easy. He stepped out of the car, glancing around nervously. The night air was cold, and the streets felt empty. Too empty, a chill ran down his spine. He walked down the street, following the directions from the phone. The further he went, the more isolated it felt. No sounds of traffic, no distant hum of city life. Just the quiet of the industrial park, the occasional flicker of a broken streetlight. When he arrived at the warehouse, he didn't see anyone at first. The building stood in silence, its windows dark. It didn't look like much, just an old, abandoned structure, with rusting doors and cracked windows. But Elon knew better than to underestimate appearances. This was the place. He had to trust that David would be here, that he would have answers. He stepped inside. The interior of the warehouse was vast, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence. There were stacks of crates in the corners, broken machinery scattered around, and a cold metallic scent that filled the air. It was the perfect setting for what Elon had come to realize was no ordinary meeting. "Elon," a voice suddenly called out from the shadows. Elon turned to see David standing near the back of the warehouse, his figure illuminated by a dim overhead light. He wasn't alone. There were other figures standing beside him, men and women in dark clothing, all with serious expressions, all seemingly waiting for something. David motioned for him to approach. "You made it. Good. Come closer." Elon's heart was pounding as he walked toward him. This was it, the moment where everything he had been questioning would either fall into place or crumble apart. As he reached David, the others stepped back, as though forming a perimeter around him. The atmosphere in the warehouse felt tense, charged with something Elon's instincts told him was far from good. "We've been watching you, Elon," David said, his voice calm but filled with an undertone of something darker. "And now, it's time for you to see the truth." Elon didn't speak. His mind was racing, but he knew he had no choice but to listen. He had come this far. He needed answers. David smiled faintly. "Welcome to the real world." And with those words, everything that Elon thought he knew was about to be turned upside down. Elon stood still, his heart racing as David's words hum in the air, thick with the promise of something monumental. The dim light of the warehouse flickered above him, casting long twisted shadows across the cold concrete floor. He could feel the eyes of the others in the room on him, silent and watchful. His skin prickled with unease. "Welcome to the real world," David had said, but what did that even mean? Was this really what he had been searching for, or had he stepped into something he was never supposed to understand? David gestured to the group of people standing silently at the edges of the warehouse, their expressions hard to read. "These people," he began, "are part of a very old and very powerful organization, and we've been watching you for some time, Elon." Elon swallowed hard. "What is this? What do you want with me?" David's smile was faint, but there was no warmth in it. "We don't want anything from you, Elon. At least, not in the way you might think. We want you to understand what you've been a part of, what you've uncovered." The people in the room shifted, and one of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. He was holding something in his hand, an old worn folder. It looked out of place in this strange industrial setting, its contents hidden from view. David nodded to the man, who handed the folder to Elon. "Take a look," he said. "You'll see exactly what you're dealing with." Elon hesitated for a moment, then reached for the folder. The paper inside felt heavier than it should have. The words written on the pages weren't the ones he had expected. It wasn't a business proposal, a social study, or even a secret corporate report. It was something much darker. The folder contained photographs of people. Some of them he recognized, some he didn't. There were images of protests, riots, and social upheaval, but there was something unsettling about them. These weren't just random moments captured on film. They were carefully curated, organized, and labeled. The people in the pictures weren't just part of a protest or a movement. They were part of a design. Elon flipped through the pages quickly, his pulse rising with each new photograph. The images were of people from all walks of life, rich and poor, black and white, young and old. But there was one thing they all had in common. They were all connected, a web of faces linked together by invisible threads. "What is this?" Elon whispered, his voice shaking. "Who are these people? What are they doing?" David stepped closer, looking over his shoulder at the pictures. "These people are part of a social experiment, a large-scale one. The same kind of experiment you've been running on the streets, without even realizing it. The difference is that this is controlled. This has a purpose, a very specific one." Elon's mind raced. He had known his experiment was just a small slice of a much bigger social puzzle, but he hadn't realized how deep it went. These weren't just random people behaving in certain ways because of his disguise. This was coordinated. It was a system, a machine, and he had just been a cog in it. David continued, "What you're looking at are the results of decades of planning. Decades of studying human behavior, watching how people react when they're given certain pressures, when they're forced into certain roles. We've created movements, pushed buttons, and played with the social fabric of entire nations, all to understand the limits of control, power, and influence." Elon's head spun. This is insane. You're telling me that everything I've seen, all of it, is part of some, what, grand social experiment?" David nodded. "Exactly. But it's more than that. It's the foundation for something much bigger. A new system of control. One that can shape the future of the world, and you, Elon, have already been a part of it. Your little experiment, painting yourself as a black homeless man, testing the limits of empathy. That was just one small part of a larger picture." Elon felt the blood drain from his face as the weight of the words sank in. This wasn't just about race. It wasn't just about class. This was about manipulating people on a scale he couldn't even comprehend. His actions had unknowingly fed into something darker, something far more dangerous than he had imagined. "You see, Elon," David said, his voice almost gentle now, "the world doesn't work the way people think it does. What you've uncovered is just the beginning. But what you don't understand is that these systems, these power structures, have been in place for centuries, and now we're ready to take them to the next level." The man with the scar, still standing to the side, nodded grimly. "We've been watching for the right moment. You've seen how people behave when they're given a little push. You've seen how easy it is to manipulate their perceptions, to shape their responses based on simple variables. Race, class, status. These things can be shifted, altered, bent to suit a greater design." Elon's hands shook as he placed the folder back on the table, unable to look at it any longer. The pictures were haunting him. The connections between them, the network of faces, all of them linked together in some kind of orchestrated chaos. "But why me?" Elon managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you pick me?" David's eyes gleamed with a mix of admiration and something colder, more calculating. "You're different, Elon. You've always been different. You've built companies, changed industries. But what you don't realize is that you've been conditioned to be a part of this system, just like everyone else. The experiment you conducted on the streets, that wasn't just curiosity. It was a test to see if you could become aware of the system you're a part of without losing yourself." Elon's breath caught in his throat. "And if I don't want to be part of it? If I don't want to be involved?" David's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. "You don't have a choice anymore, Elon. You've already played your part, and now the only way out is to take the next step." Elon felt a chill run down his spine. His mind raced. What was David talking about? There had to be another way out, but the look in David's eyes told him that there was no escape. The more he learned, the deeper he got. "What do you want from me?" Elon asked again, his voice shaking now. "What do you need me to do?" David walked around the table, closer to Elon, his steps measured and deliberate. "What we need from you is simple. You need to help us finish what you've started. You've uncovered the core of the system, Elon, and now it's time for you to help us perfect it. Help us take it global." The words hung in the air like a suffocating fog. Elon's mind raced, desperately trying to piece together what was happening. This was no longer an experiment. This was something else entirely, something much darker. A network of power and control that spanned the globe. David continued, his voice low and persuasive. "You've already seen how easy it is to shift people's perceptions. How simple it is to influence behavior when you understand the right triggers. With your help, we can refine these systems, take them to the next level, and reshape the world as we see fit." Elon felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His thoughts churned, conflicted. He had always prided himself on being someone who could shape the future, someone who could change the world. But this was something he couldn't control, something he couldn't stand behind. He took a step back, his mind racing. I need to think. David didn't seem to mind. Take all the time you need. But understand this, Elon. The moment you decide to walk away, you'll become a threat. We've invested too much into this to let anyone disrupt it now. Elon turned, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he had to leave. But as he turned to walk out of the warehouse, he knew one thing for certain. There was no way back from this. Not anymore. The game had changed, and Elon Musk had just become a player in a much larger and far more dangerous world. The question was, what would he do with the power he had just been given? Elon's footsteps echoed in the cold, empty warehouse as he made his way toward the exit. His mind was a maelstrom of thoughts, each one louder than the last. The weight of what David had said pressed down on him like an invisible force. He had never felt so powerless. He paused at the warehouse door, his hand resting on the cold metal handle. The world outside, bathed in the faint glow of the city's streetlights, felt distant now, as though he had crossed into another reality. A reality where the rules he had lived by for his entire life didn't seem to apply anymore. A reality where the systems of power were invisible, controlling everything from the shadows. David's words had cut deep. The moment you decide to walk away, you'll become a threat. Elon took a deep breath, his chest tightening. What did that even mean? What kind of threat could he be? He wasn't a revolutionary or a rebel. He wasn't some underground freedom fighter. He was a businessman, a billionaire with a track record of innovation. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of a game he hadn't signed up for, surrounded by people who were more than willing to manipulate the world on a scale he couldn't even begin to understand. What if David and his group were right? What if the whole world had been nothing more than an elaborate controlled experiment, just like the one he'd started? What if he had been a part of it all along without ever realizing it? But then again, what if they were wrong? What if he did have a choice, the choice to step away, to expose them for what they were, to stop the manipulation before it was too late? Could he even do that? Could he bring down something this massive, this ingrained in society? His mind flashed to the faces in the photographs, people whose lives had been manipulated, twisted, used as pawns in some larger game. He had seen the raw emotion, the confusion, the struggle in those faces. They were victims, just like him, maybe even more so. But did that make him their savior? Could he be their savior? A sudden voice broke through the fog of his thoughts. It was David, his voice echoing from behind him. "Don't make the mistake of thinking you have a choice, Elon," he said, his tone cool but firm. "You do not walk away from this, not anymore. You're already too far in. The wheels are in motion. The plan is in place." Elon turned slowly, his hand still on the door handle. He looked back at David and the others in the room, feeling a cold sense of dread settle in his stomach. The faces in the shadows were unreadable, watching him like a lion watches its prey. David stepped forward, his expression unchanged. "I know what you're thinking. You're wondering if you can still escape. But you can't. Not after everything you've seen. You've opened your eyes to a truth most people will never know. And now you have to decide. Do you help us shape the future, or do you fight against it, knowing full well what the consequences will be?" The words hummed in the air. Elon felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. This wasn't about helping anyone. This was about control, about manipulating the world for the benefit of a few people in a room like this one. But he also knew that fighting back would come with its own dangers, its own consequences. "Why me?" Elon said, his voice sharp. "Why did you pick me? I'm not like you. I'm not part of your system." David's smile was faint, almost pitying. "That's where you're wrong, Elon. You've always been part of the system. You just didn't know it. You built your empire, changed industries, revolutionized technology, all the while unknowingly feeding into the very mechanisms that we've carefully crafted. You see, we don't need you to join us. We need you to understand why it's necessary." "I don't understand," Elon replied, shaking his head. "What do you mean? Why is all of this necessary? What's the point?" David's expression hardened. "The point is survival. The world as we know it is crumbling, Elon. The systems of governance, economics, and social order are unsustainable. The only way to ensure stability, to ensure that the human race can survive the coming decades, is to create a new order. And we need people like you, visionaries, influencers, people who understand how to move the masses, to help us make that vision a reality." Elon took a step back, his mind reeling. "You're telling me you want to build a new world order, a world where you pull the strings?" David didn't flinch. "Exactly. The difference is, we'll be doing it for the benefit of humanity, not for the elites, but the people who resist, Those who refuse to accept the truth of what's coming will be left behind. Elon's hands clenched into fists. He didn't believe it. He didn't believe that this was the only way forward. He couldn't. He had built his companies on the belief that innovation, competition, and the free market would drive humanity toward a brighter future. But this felt like a trap, a carefully orchestrated manipulation to reshape society in their image. David stepped closer, his eyes boring into Elon's. "You're not the first to question this, Elon. But you might be the last. You might be the only one with the power to stop this, or to help us make it happen." Elon's breath came in short bursts. He had no idea what the right decision was anymore. But as he stood there, his mind whirling, something inside him clicked, something fundamental. He wasn't going to play their game. He wasn't going to be their pawn. "I won't help you," Elon said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling inside him. David's eyes narrowed. For the first time, there was a flicker of something darker in his gaze. "You really think it's that easy, don't you?" he said, his tone icy. Elon didn't answer. He turned and walked toward the exit, his steps deliberate. As he reached the door, he heard David's voice again, but this time, it wasn't calm or composed. It was cold. "You think you can walk away from this? You think you can just leave? You're already too deep, Elon. They know who you are now. They'll be watching you. Every move you make, every step you take. And when the time comes, you'll be forced to decide." Elon hesitated for a moment, but then he opened the door. The cold night air hit him like a slap in the face, but it felt good. It felt like freedom. But he knew as he stepped into the dark street that he was far from free. David's words echoed in his mind. "They know who you are now." And as Elon walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Something dark was coming, and he didn't know if he could stop it. Elon walked through the dimly lit streets, the weight of what had just transpired settling heavily on his shoulders. His hands were trembling slightly, his mind still reeling from the confrontation in the warehouse. What had he just done? He had chosen to walk away, but could he really escape the consequences of his decision? The night felt colder than before. His footsteps echoed in the emptiness around him, a reminder that he was now a part of something far bigger than he could have imagined. David's words still echoed in his head. "They know who you are now. They'll be watching you." Who were they? And how could David have known that Elon would make the decision to leave? Was this part of the plan all along? Elon stopped in his tracks. He had been so focused on the meeting, on the offer David had presented, that he hadn't stopped to consider the larger implications. This wasn't just some secret society trying to change the world. It was a web of influence, stretching across industries, governments, and systems, an invisible hand that guided every major decision and controlled every outcome. A shadowy force with a reach so far that even the most powerful figures on the planet didn't realize they were being manipulated. He couldn't help but think back to his own work, the companies he'd built, the technologies he pioneered. Was he just another pawn in their game? Had they been watching him all along, shaping his moves, pushing him in certain directions? The thought was chilling. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. Elon pulled it out, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the name on the screen. It was David. He stared at the phone for a moment, his mind racing. What now? What could David possibly want after everything that had just happened? He answered the call. "Elon," David's voice came through, calm as always. "I hope you're not thinking you've won." Elon's pulse quickened. "I'm not playing your game, David," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I walked away. I'm done with this." David chuckled, the sound smooth but devoid of humor. "You think walking away is an option? You think you can just forget everything you've seen, pretend like nothing happened? I told you before, you can't escape this. You're already part of it, and whether you like it or not, you'll play your part." Elon gritted his teeth. "You can't control me. I'm not going to be your puppet." "Oh, but you already are," David said, his tone turning darker. "You just don't realize it yet. Everything you've done, everything you've built, it's all connected. You've been part of this system your entire life, whether you knew it or not. And the moment you made that decision, the moment you started questioning what you've been taught to believe, you sealed your fate." Elon's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" David didn't answer immediately. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Elon wondered if he had hung up. Then David spoke again, his voice low and deliberate. "You've become a threat, Elon. People like you, people with power, influence, and vision. They can't be left to think for themselves. Not when they begin to question the system. Not when they start to see things for what they really are." Elon felt his heart pound in his chest. "Who are you talking about? Who are these people? David's voice dropped to a whisper. You'll find out soon enough. Elon's hands clenched around the phone, his mind racing. He had been warned. He knew that David wasn't someone who made idle threats. The people behind this organization, whoever they were, didn't just let things go. They didn't let people like him walk away without consequences. I'm done with this, David, Elon said, his voice more forceful now. I'll expose you. I'll tell the world what you're really doing. This isn't some social experiment. It's a conspiracy. You're manipulating people, controlling them, using them like puppets. David was silent for a moment, then he sighed, almost as if he was pitying Elon. You still don't understand, did you? You think exposing us will stop this? Do you really think anyone will believe you? The system is too strong, too ingrained. You'll be fighting an army you can't see. And the moment you make a move, the moment you step out of line, you'll become the enemy. Elon's thoughts raced. David was right about one thing. He wasn't just dealing with some rogue group. This wasn't a small conspiracy. This was something global, something that reached into every aspect of society. What could he possibly do to stop it? Could he really expose them, or would he just be walking into a trap? You don't have to do this, Elon, David said, his tone almost coaxing now. You have power. You have influence. You can help us make the world a better place. Just join us. Help us build the future. Elon took a deep breath, his mind battling with the urge to fight back and the fear of the unknown. I'll never join you, he said finally, his voice steady. I won't be a part of your plan. David's voice softened, almost in a whisper. Then prepare yourself, Elon, because you're about to find out just how dangerous it is to cross people like us. Before Elon could respond, the call abruptly ended. He stared at his phone, his mind whirling. This wasn't just a warning. This was a declaration of war. Elon wasn't sure what was happening next, but he knew one thing for certain. His life had just become infinitely more dangerous. He wasn't dealing with a group of shadowy figures anymore. He was up against a powerful invisible system that had already made its move. And he was in the crosshairs. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Elon tried to return to his normal routine, but everything felt different. Every phone call, every email, every meeting seemed like part of some larger plan he couldn't see. The weight of the knowledge he had uncovered felt like a constant presence on his shoulders. He couldn't escape it. He tried to get in touch with his closest allies, but something always felt off. His calls went unanswered, his emails ignored. Even his personal assistant, who had always been efficient and reliable, seemed distant, almost evasive. The paranoia began to settle in, creeping into every corner of his life. It wasn't until the third day that the first warning arrived. Elon was sitting in his office, staring at a report on Tesla's latest quarterly earnings, when the door to his office opened. His assistant, Marie, stepped inside, her face pale. Elon, you need to see this, she said, her voice tense. Elon stood up, confused. What is it? Marie handed him a piece of paper. It was a printout of an article from an obscure news website. Elon scanned the headline, and his heart skipped a beat. Elon Musk exposed as puppet in global control scheme. Sources reveal the truth behind his social experiment. The article was a mix of half-truths and fabricated details, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. Someone somewhere was pulling strings, and they were already planting seeds of doubt. Elon looked at Marie, his mind racing. Where did this come from? She hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. I don't know, but it's everywhere. The article has gone viral. It's on every social media platform, every news outlet. The ground beneath Elon's feet felt like it was shifting. He was being hunted. The people behind this game weren't just watching him anymore. They were taking action. But who was behind it? Who was spreading these lies? And more importantly, who was controlling the narrative now? He could feel it. The game was changing, and he had no idea what the next move was. But one thing was clear. He couldn't trust anyone, not anymore. As the walls closed in around him, Elon realized that he had made a decision he couldn't undo. He had chosen to walk away from their world, but they weren't going to let him leave. Not without a fight. The question was, how far would they go to make sure he played by their rules? And how much was he willing to risk to stop them? Elon stared at the screen, the article mocking him like a cruel joke. Exposed as a puppet in a global control scheme. The words danced across the screen, twisted and distorted, much like the reality he was now facing. This was no longer a choice he could control. It wasn't just about stepping away anymore, it was about survival. He paced across the room, running his hands through his hair in frustration. His office, once a place of creativity and innovation, felt like a trap now. His phone buzzed again, a message from an unknown number. "You're on the radar. They know you're awake. Stay alert. Trust no one." It was a chilling message. Who could have sent it? Had they already infiltrated his communications? How far did the reach go? The thought was enough to make his skin crawl. Marie, still standing in the doorway, looked uncertain. "Elon, you need to understand. This isn't just about a few rumors. It's bigger. They'll come after you. They'll make sure you're silenced." He turned to her, desperation in his eyes. "Who are they? Who is doing this?" Marie hesitated before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know exactly, but it's not just David and his group. There's something bigger, something more organized. There's a network of people who control everything. You're in the middle of it now. You've seen too much." Elon could feel the walls closing in. He wasn't sure who to trust, who to believe anymore. His own assistant, someone he had relied on for years, was acting strange. Was she part of it too? Was she working with them? Or was she genuinely scared for his safety? "I need to think," he said, his voice tight. He paced across the room again, his mind racing. There had to be a way out of this, a way to fight back. He couldn't just give up. He wasn't going to let them control him. Elon's thoughts turned back to his own companies. Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink. These were his creations, the products of his vision. But now, everything seemed like part of the system he was supposed to be fighting against. Was it possible that they had been guiding him all along? That his so-called innovations were nothing more than pawns in a game he hadn't understood? He couldn't trust anyone now. His every move was being watched. The media, the corporations, even the government, it was all connected. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized how deep the conspiracy ran. Suddenly, the door to his office slammed open, and two men in suits stepped inside. They were tall, clean-shaven, and their eyes were cold, emotionless. Elon's heart raced as he instinctively backed away from them, his mind already running through escape scenarios. "Mr. Musk," one of the men said, his voice smooth but firm. "We need to talk." Elon's pulse spiked. He recognized the tone of authority. These were not just random agents. They were part of something bigger. His instinct told him to fight back, to run, but the cold glint in their eyes told him that escape was not an option. "I'm not going anywhere with you," Elon said, his voice steady despite the fear churning inside him. The man stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Elon's face. "You don't have a choice. We've been watching you, Mr. Musk. We know what you're planning. And we can assure you, whatever you think you're going to do, it won't end well for you." "Who are you?" Elon demanded, his fists clenched. The man didn't answer. Instead, he motioned to his companion, who stepped forward and placed something small and metallic on the desk in front of Elon. It was a sleek black device, with an odd symbol engraved on the surface, something that Elon didn't recognize. "This is a tracker," the man said, his tone cold. "A device that will allow us to keep an eye on your every move. You're not going anywhere, Mr. Musk. Not without our knowledge." Elon's blood ran cold. A tracker? They had placed a tracking device on him? The implications were terrifying. "Take it," the man ordered, his voice unwavering. "It's the only way you'll stay alive." Elon stood frozen for a moment. He felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Was he really trapped? Could he escape? He was so close to the edge of something monumental, but now it seemed like they had him cornered. He glanced at Marie, who stood quietly in the corner, her eyes wide with fear. She was as trapped as he was, wasn't she? He couldn't count on anyone. "You can't control me," Elon spat, though his words felt weak in the face of the men's unyielding presence. The man gave a small, humorless smile. "We don't need to control you, Elon. We just need you to think we do." Before Elon could respond, the door slammed shut behind him, leaving him alone with the ominous device on his desk. The silence that followed was deafening. He stood there, staring at the tracker, wondering if taking it was the only way out. But would that make him their prisoner? Would he ever be free again? Later that night, as Elon sat in his darkened office, the weight of the tracker pressing down on him, he couldn't help but feel the overwhelming sense of dread. He was no longer sure of anything. Was there anyone he could trust? Could he trust Marie? Could he even trust himself? His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a simple text message from an anonymous number. "They're watching you, but you can still fight back. The first move is yours." The message sent a chill through his spine. Who was this? A friend? An enemy? Or someone else trying to manipulate him? Elon's eyes flickered toward the tracker on his desk. The thought of being controlled, of being watched constantly, made his skin crawl. But if he didn't do something soon, they would have complete control over him. He stood up, his decision made. He had no choice but to play their game for now. He had to figure out who was pulling the strings. He needed answers, and if he couldn't find them on his own, he would have to risk everything to uncover the truth. Elon grabbed the tracker and, without a second thought, slipped it into his pocket. As he walked out of his office and into the cold night air, he knew he was walking into danger. But for the first time, the fear wasn't the most terrifying thing. It was the realization that the game had already begun, and the first move was now his. The night air was biting as Elon stepped out of his office, the weight of the small black tracker in his pocket a constant reminder that he was being watched. He hadn't expected the two men in suits to be so direct, so cold. The idea that they had a tracking device on him, on his every move, was unnerving. But he knew he had no choice but to play along for now. He had to understand who these people were, what they were after, and most importantly, how to stop them. His mind was spinning as he got into his car and drove through the quiet streets of Palo Alto. It was strange. He had always been in control of his own destiny. He had always believed that with enough ingenuity, he could overcome any obstacle. But this felt like a different kind of battle. It wasn't about technology or business strategy. It was about survival. And for the first time in years, Elon didn't feel like he had all the answers. As he drove, he thought about the message he had received earlier. They're watching you, but you can still fight back. The first move is yours. Who had sent it? Was it someone trying to help him? Or was it another piece of the puzzle, another layer of manipulation designed to keep him off balance? He needed answers. By the time Elon arrived at his home, the weight of the decision he had made, the choice to take the tracker, to play their game, felt heavier than ever. As he entered his house, he found himself standing in the dark, feeling a strange sense of isolation. His phone buzzed once more. This time, it was an encrypted message, with no return number. The message was short, direct. "We know what you're planning. You'll never escape." Elon's breath caught in his throat. The message felt like a final warning. He wasn't just dealing with powerful people. He was up against an organization that had the resources to track his every move, to predict his next step before he even knew it himself. He stared at the phone, the words burning in his mind. "You'll never escape." Was there truth in that? Was he already too far in? The thought made his skin crawl. He needed to get out. He needed to make a plan. But the question was, where could he go? Who could he trust? The following days were a blur of tension and fear. Elon kept a low profile, staying in constant motion. Every time he thought he was safe, every time he thought he was one step ahead, something would happen to remind him that the people behind this game were always watching. His emails were intercepted. Calls that he made to trusted allies were rerouted. Even Marie, his assistant, seemed distant, more guarded than ever. There was no one he could turn to. Not really. He had been isolated, pushed into a corner where the only way out was to keep moving, to keep looking for answers. Elon knew he needed to take back control. But how? What was the key to understanding this shadowy network? Was it David, the man who had first brought him into this twisted world? Or was it someone else, someone even more dangerous, pulling the strings from the shadows? One morning, as Elon sat in his office at Tesla, trying to work through his daily responsibilities, while mentally preparing for what was to come, he received a strange email. The subject line simply read, "Meet me." There was no sender's name, no contact information, just a set of coordinates for a remote location in the hills above the city. The message was cryptic, but there was something about it that felt urgent, like a lifeline in the midst of a storm. His heart raced. Was this the break he had been waiting for? Or was it another trap? Against his better judgment, Elon decided to go. He couldn't afford to keep second-guessing every move. He needed to get to the bottom of this, to find out who was behind the conspiracy, and to make a stand before it was too late. The drive to the coordinates took longer than he expected. The road grew steeper, the air colder as he ascended into the hills. As he reached the top, the landscape opened up into a secluded area, surrounded by trees and the distant hum of the city far below. There was no sign of anyone, no cars, no people, just an empty, silent expanse. It felt like a ghost town, like an illusion, but he had come this far. He couldn't turn back now. Elon parked the car and stepped out, the cold air biting at his skin. He was alone. For a moment, he stood there, unsure of what to do. But then he heard it, the faintest sound of movement, a rustle in the trees. He turned, his heart pounding in his chest, his senses on high alert. From the shadows emerged a figure, tall, hooded, with a face that seemed familiar, yet hidden in the dark. The figure took a step forward, and for a moment, Elon wondered if this was a trap, if the people who had been watching him were setting him up for something much worse. But then the figure spoke and Elon froze. "Elon," the voice was low and calm, but there was something urgent about it. "I'm glad you came." It was a voice he recognized, David. But this wasn't the same man he had spoken to in the warehouse. This man was different. He looked worn. His eyes were bloodshot, his expression filled with a quiet desperation. "What's going on?" Elon demanded, stepping back. "What is all of this? Who are you really?" David looked around nervously before stepping closer. "We don't have much time. They're listening. They've always been listening. But you need to know the truth, Elon. Everything you've seen, everything you've learned so far, it's all part of something much bigger, something far more dangerous." Elon's mind raced. "What do you mean? Who are they?" David took a deep breath. "They're not just some shadowy elite group. They've been pulling the strings for centuries, shaping the world to their will. The government, the media, the corporations, all of it. They've been setting the stage for this moment, and you've been a key player without even knowing it." Elon felt a chill run down his spine. "But why me? Why now?" David's eyes locked onto his, intense and filled with fear. "Because you're the only one who can stop them. You're the only one who has the vision, the resources, and the ability to fight back. But you need to understand something. You can't do it alone." Elon's heart pounded in his chest. "I don't trust you. I don't trust anyone. How do I know you're not a part of this?" David shook his head. "I was once one of them, but I left. I got out. I tried to warn others, but they silenced me. They've been watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. And now they're in their sights, Elon. They won't let you walk away. Not now." Elon stepped back, his mind whirling. "If what you're saying is true, if they're as powerful as you say, then how can I possibly fight back?" David's expression hardened. "You have to go after the source. You have to expose them. If you don't, the world will fall under their control. Forever." Elon stared at him, struggling to process everything he had just been told. The gravity of the situation was unlike anything he had ever faced before. The stakes were higher than anything he had imagined. But he knew one thing for certain now: his life, his legacy, everything he had worked for. None of it mattered if he didn't take action. This was bigger than business, bigger than technology. It was about the future of the world. David stepped closer, his voice urgent. "You're in the middle of something dangerous, Elon. You have no idea what they're capable of. You have to make a choice. Do you fight, or do you let them win?" Elon felt a surge of determination. There was no going back now. Whatever it took, he was going to stop them. He wasn't going to let them destroy everything he had worked for. He nodded, steeling himself for what was to come. "I'll fight," he said, his voice firm. "I'll expose them, no matter what." David looked at him, a mixture of relief and fear in his eyes. "Then it begins. But you need to be ready. This is only the start of something much bigger, and you'll never be safe again." As Elon turned to face the darkness, he realized that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. The hunt was on, and it was only just beginning. Elon felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him as he and David stood in the cold, shadowed clearing. The words that had come from David's mouth had shaken into his core. "You're in the middle of something dangerous. You're the only one who can stop them. This is bigger than anything you've ever imagined." He had to admit, a part of him felt overwhelmed. The magnitude of the situation was suffocating, and yet another part of him felt alive, more awake than ever. In the face of this unimaginable force, he could either cower, let them win, or he could stand up and try to fight back. And if there was one thing Elon Musk didn't do, it was back down. "We don't have much time," David said urgently, his eyes scanning the horizon. "They'll know you're here soon. You need to get moving. Make your next move while they're still distracted." Elon nodded, his mind racing. "How do we start? How do we even begin to fight them?" David hesitated, his brow furrowing as though he wasn't sure how much he could reveal. Finally, he spoke in a low, measured tone. "There's a group, underground, hidden, like we used to be. They're the last hope. They can help you. But you have to find them. You have to trust them. But first, you need to disappear. And I mean completely disappear." Elon's heart sank. Disappear? That was no longer an option. It had already begun. The moment he had taken that tracking device, he'd sealed his fate. He was already on their radar, and hiding now might only make him more vulnerable. But still, if this underground group was real, if they really could help, it might be his only shot. "How to find them?" Elon asked, his voice steady despite the overwhelming flood of thoughts that crashed through his mind. David looked around, as though making sure no one else was within earshot. Then, in a whisper, he said, "They'll find you first. You don't have to search for them. They'll know where you are. But you have to be ready to move. Trust no one, not even the people closest to you. Especially not the people closest to you." David's warning was clear, and Elon understood its weight. It was terrifying, but he was past the point of worrying about what was terrifying. The paranoia gnawing at him had already taken hold, and there was no going back. Elon glanced down at the tracker in his pocket. It was a constant reminder of how deep he had gotten into something that wasn't just a business deal or a technological breakthrough. It was a fight for his life. David stepped back and reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, unmarked envelope. He handed it to Elon. "Inside, you'll find a name. Someone you can trust. They'll help you get started. Don't ask questions, just go. And remember, no one can know what you're doing." Elon took the envelope, feeling its weight in his hands. It wasn't thick, but it felt heavy, like a turning point in his life. The name inside was the key to everything. His pulse quickened as he stuffed it into his jacket pocket. He didn't look at it yet, couldn't afford to. There was no time to waste. He turned to David. "I'll go. But what about you?" David's face hardened, a shadow crossing over his features. "I'm already too far gone. They'll find me before I get another chance to run. But you still have a shot. Don't waste it." With those final words, David turned and disappeared into the trees. Elon stood there for a moment, taking in the weight of the situation. The man who had helped him see the truth was already gone, and now the burden was on him to make the first move, to expose them all. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elon drove away from the hills, his mind already working through his next steps. The city lights twinkled below, distant and warm, but they felt like they belonged to another world. A world where everything was normal, where his name was just a name, where he wasn't hunted by shadowy figures, constantly looking over his shoulder. He drove in silence, his thoughts swirling. The message from David echoed in his mind. Trust no one, not even the people closest to you. It was a bitter truth, one that cut deep. Who could he trust? Everyone around him had become suspect. Even Marie, who had worked for him for years, now seemed like an unknown. Was she in on this? Had she been part of the scheme all along? He pulled into his driveway, the familiar side of his home doing little to ease his mind. He needed to make a choice. He couldn't stay here any longer, couldn't risk being found by whoever was tracking him. The envelope in his pocket seemed to burn a hole in his side, and for the first time in his life, Elon was uncertain. Uncertain of what to do, uncertain of who to trust, uncertain of how far he could push himself before it all unraveled. As he stepped out of the car and walked toward the door, a noise caught his attention. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the familiar sound breaking through the tension in his chest. Elon's heart stopped when he saw the name on the screen, Marie. He took a deep breath before answering, trying to sound calm, trying to keep his voice steady. "Hello?" "Elon," Marie's voice came through, shaky and tense. "We need to talk. Now." He froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. The air around him seemed to still, the weight of the moment settling in. There was no way to know if this was another trap, another manipulation. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice cold, careful. I can't say much over the phone," Marie whispered. "But it's not just you. They know. They know everything. And they're coming for us. They're coming for you. We have to leave. Now." Elon's mind raced. This was it, the moment he had feared, the moment he knew would come. They had found him. They were closing in. "Where do we go?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. There was a pause on the other end. Marie's voice was barely audible. "I can't say, but I can help. I'm not a part of it, Elon. I swear, I'm trying to help you. But we need to act quickly, before they get to you." Elon's heart raced as he thought about what to do next. He wanted to believe her. But after everything that had happened, he couldn't afford to take risks. Not now. "I'll be there," he said, and before she could respond, he hung up. His mind was made up. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he couldn't hesitate anymore. There was no more time for second-guessing. He grabbed the envelope, ripped it open, and looked at the name written inside. His eyes widened. It was a name he knew well. Too well. The name of someone he had trusted. A name he had never thought he would see in this context. The final piece of the puzzle had been laid out before him. The truth was about to come crashing down on him in ways he hadn't even begun to understand. The reckoning had arrived, and there was no turning back. The name in the envelope burned in Elon's hand, Jeff Bezos. Elon's mind went blank for a moment. He stared at the paper, trying to process the fact that the name of his closest rival, The man he had once seen as a business competitor, someone who had built his own empire from the ground up, was now part of the conspiracy that had turned his life into a nightmare. For a moment, the world seemed to slow down. The dots he had been trying to connect for days, weeks, maybe even months, suddenly fell into place. The shadowy figures who had been tracking him, the media manipulation, the unrelenting pressure to keep innovating, pushing boundaries, as if someone were orchestrating it all from behind the scenes. It wasn't just about business anymore, this was personal. Jeff Bezos wasn't just a rival in tech. He was a player in the very system that had set its sights on controlling the world. The thought hit Elon like a punch to the stomach. How long had this been going on? How long had Bezos, and others like him, been pulling strings behind the curtain? He stood still for a long moment, struggling to steady his breath. If this was the man who had orchestrated everything, the manipulation, the tracking, the surveillance, then Elon had no choice but to confront him. But how, and where, and most importantly, was he ready for the cost of this final confrontation? There was no going back now. The only way out was through. He couldn't keep running. The world, the system, had already marked him as a target. The conspiracy had already woven its threads through his life. He had one final move to make: expose Bezos and everyone connected to him, before they silenced him forever. Elon arrived at the meeting place where he had arranged to meet Marie. She had insisted on seeing him in person, desperate to explain herself. The tension in the air felt suffocating, the weight of their conversation hanging between them like a storm about to break. He parked his car a few blocks away from the designated spot and walked the final distance on foot. He could feel his heart pounding with every step. Was this truly a safe place? Was Marie on his side, or had he just been another pawn in a game he didn't understand? When he reached the alleyway where they were supposed to meet, he saw Marie standing by a dimly lit street lamp. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but there was a determination in the way she stood. "Elon," she said quietly, her voice shaky. "I'm sorry. I never wanted this to happen." "What are you talking about?" Elon asked, his voice sharp. The sudden feeling of betrayal surged through him, but he pushed it down, focusing on what mattered. "I couldn't tell you everything, but I had to protect you. I had to make sure you didn't get too close to the truth." She paused, looking around nervously. "They knew about us from the beginning. I had no choice but to play my part." Elon felt his pulse quicken. Who's behind all of this? Who's pulling the strings? Marie looked at him, her face filled with fear. "It's not just Bezos. He's part of it, but there's someone else. Someone more powerful, more dangerous. Someone who has been manipulating everything, media, business, politics for years. It's been a long game, Elon, and you've been a major piece of it all along." She hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're not the first person they've targeted. You won't be the last, but you can still fight back. You still have a chance." Elon felt the weight of her words. This wasn't just a conspiracy. This was a network of power, so deeply entrenched that it spanned the globe. It had infiltrated every part of society, every part of his life. Suddenly, there was a sound from behind them. Elon spun around, his heart racing, and there in the shadows stood a tall figure, his face hidden under the hood of a jacket. You didn't need to see his face to know who it was. "David, I told you to trust no one." David's voice rang out, firm and resolute. "But you wouldn't listen. I'm sorry, Elon." Before Elon could react, he heard a familiar harsh click behind him. Someone had pointed a gun at the back of his head. He tensed, his muscles going rigid, but didn't turn around. He knew who it was without looking. The same shadowy group that had been pulling the strings had finally caught up with him. Mary gasped, stepping back. "No, Elon, don't." The figure behind him laughed. "You should have stayed quiet, Musk. You had no idea what you were getting yourself into." Elon's mind raced. This was it. They were going to take him out, just like they had taken out others before him. He had done everything he could. He had fought back with everything he had, but it hadn't been enough. The game was over. He turned to face his captor, taking in a deep breath as he steeled himself for what was coming. Suddenly, the streetlights flickered. A blinding flash of light exploded in front of him, followed by a sharp crack. The figure behind him collapsed, and in an instant, two more figures emerged from the shadows, masked, their faces covered by black cloths. Mary's eyes widened as one of the figures threw her to the ground. "Stay down," one of them shouted. Elon barely had time to process what was happening. The second masked figure approached him quickly, pulling him away from the chaos. "Come on," the figure said, pulling him into an alleyway. "We don't have much time." As they ran, Elon tried to gather his bearings. Who were these people? Were they the underground group David had spoken of? Finally, they reached a hidden door at the back of an old building. The figure knocked twice, a quick, coded sequence. The door opened, revealing a dimly lit room filled with people, strangers, all of them. Some were sitting at computers, others talking in hushed voices. All of them appeared to be on edge, working together in a way that suggested they knew exactly what was happening. The figure who had helped Elon shut the door behind them. "You're safe for now. But it's not over. We've been watching, and we know everything." Elon stared at them, his mind racing. "Who are you?" The masked figure pulled down their hood, revealing a familiar face. "Hello, Elon," the person said. "We're the last resistance, and it's time for you to finish what you started." It was someone Elon never would have expected. Someone he had once trusted completely. Marie. But this was a different Marie. A Marie who had played her part in a larger game. And now she was leading him into the final stage. "You've been part of this all along?" Elon asked, his voice thick with disbelief. Marie nodded. "It's not just about stopping Bezos. It's about stopping everything, the system, the corruption, the control. We've been waiting for you. You have the power to destroy it all, but you need to act quickly. There's no time left." The realization hit Elon with the force of 1,000 storms. The system he had been part of, the system that had built him up and then sought to tear him down. It had all been a lie. And now, he had the power to bring it crashing down, to expose everything, to destroy the empire that had controlled his life for so long. This was the moment. Elon took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know if he was ready. But one thing was clear, the game was not over. It had just begun. And this time, he was the one in control. As he stepped forward into the unknown, ready to take the final steps in his journey, he knew that the world would never be the same again. And neither would he.